April 21, 2003. Carry-le-Rouet, France. Nina Simone, born Eunice Waymon in North Carolina's Red Clay, died in a modest villa overlooking the Mediterranean, as far from home as a voice can travel while still carrying the weight of American pain. At 70, the high priestess of soul left the world in silence, exiled from the country that had both celebrated and betrayed her extraordinary gifts. The small room where she drew her final breath held the artifacts of a life lived in permanent exile from her own dreams. A piano sat silent in the corner, its keys worn smooth by fingers that had mastered Bach at 12 but spent decades translating rage into revolution through melodies that made comfortable people dangerous to themselves. Scattered sheet music told the story of a woman who had wanted to play Carnegie Hall as a classical pianist, but instead conquered it as a musical revolutionary. When news reached America, the tributes poured in with the selective memory that fame allows. Radio stations played Feeling Good and I Put a Spell on You on endless repeat while carefully avoiding Mississippi Goddam, the song that had transformed her from entertainer into threat, from diva into prophet, from beloved performer into exiled conscience of a nation that preferred its black artists grateful rather than truthful. The irony was suffocating even in death. Everyone suddenly remembered loving the woman they had spent decades trying to silence. Politicians who had once called her dangerous now praised her courage. Music executives who had blacklisted her political songs now celebrated her as a pioneer. The sanitized remembrances missed the essential truth. Nina Simone had never wanted to be comfortable or safe. She had wanted to use her voice as a weapon against injustice, to prove that extraordinary talent came with extraordinary obligations. No suicide note was found, no dramatic final statement, just the peaceful end of a woman who had lived with volcanic intensity for 7 decades, whose every performance had been both prayer and declaration of war. Was this quiet death in foreign soil a surrender or one last act of defiance from someone who had spent her life refusing to die quietly while her people suffered? But to understand how the girl who dreamed of playing Bach ended up singing blues in exile, we must return to the red clay and rigid segregation of Depression-era North Carolina, where a child named Eunice learned that talent could be both divine gift and generational curse. Tryon, North Carolina, 1933. In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where Jim Crow laws were as immutable as geography, Eunice Kathleen Waymon entered a world that would spend the next 70 years trying to decide whether her gifts were miraculous or dangerous. Born into a family where poverty was constant but music was sacred, she showed signs of genius that would later terrify and inspire millions. Her father, John Divine Waymon, was a handyman whose calloused fingers could coax hymns from broken piano keys despite never learning to read music. Her mother, Mary Kate, cleaned white folks' houses during the week and led the church choir on Sundays with a voice that could make grown men weep and confess their sins. In the Waymon household, music wasn't entertainment. It was survival prayer, and the closest thing to freedom that black families could claim in a world designed to crush their dreams. Eunice's relationship with the piano was mystical from the beginning. At 3, she was picking out melodies by ear. By 6, she was playing Bach inventions with technical precision that left church congregations stunned into reverent silence. Local white families began paying for her lessons, recognizing a talent so extraordinary that even racial prejudice couldn't completely suppress it, though it would spend decades trying. The moment that would define everything came when she was 12 years old, performing at a church recital for an integrated audience. Young Eunice watched her parents being forced to give up their front-row seats to white latecomers who felt entitled to the best view of her God-given talent. She stopped playing mid-phrase, crossed her thin arms, and announced with steel in her child's voice that she wouldn't continue until her parents were returned to their rightful seats. The silence that followed was electric. 100 people held their breath as a 12-year-old girl used her gift as leverage, discovering in that moment that talent could be power if you were brave enough to wield it as a weapon. Her parents were returned to their seats. She finished her performance, and Eunice Waymon learned the lesson that would shape every day of her remaining life. Never accept injustice quietly, even when silence would be safer. Could this early act of musical rebellion have been the seed from which everything else grew? Was young Eunice already discovering that being extraordinary meant being dangerous, that gifts like hers came with obligations that would define every breath she took? The scholarship opportunities that followed seemed like salvation, a chance to escape the suffocating limitations of the Jim Crow South and become the classical pianist she dreamed of being. But even as a teenager, Eunice was learning that being a prodigy didn't guarantee acceptance in a world that preferred its black performers safely contained within acceptable boundaries. The rejection from the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia cut deeper than any physical wound. Her audition had been flawless, her technique beyond question, but the letter that arrived weeks later was politely devastating. Not quite right for our program. Years later, she would learn that equally qualified white students had been accepted while she was turned away, for reasons that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with the color of skin that housed her genius. Juilliard in New York offered a brief respite, a place where her abilities were recognized and nurtured without the constant reminder that she was unwelcome. But the classical music world was showing her, through 1,000 small humiliations and polite redirections, that there were invisible barriers talent alone couldn't breach. Professors praised her Bach interpretations while suggesting she might consider jazz or popular music. Code words that meant concert halls weren't built for people who looked like her. The transformation from Eunice Waymon to Nina Simone began not as artistic choice but as economic necessity mixed with protective camouflage. When classical opportunities evaporated like morning mist, she found herself playing piano in Atlantic City nightclubs to pay for rent and food that Juilliard dreams couldn't provide. The club owner insisted she sing as well as play, something she had never considered professionally but discovered she could do with the same precision she brought to Bach. To protect her classical aspirations from the perceived stigma of popular music, she adopted a stage name that would become more real than her birth certificate. Nina from the Spanish for little girl, Simone borrowed from French actress Simone Signoret. What began as practical disguise became profound transformation during those smoky late-night sets where Eunice could disappear and Nina could emerge. A woman who channeled Bach's architectural precision into Billie Holiday's emotional devastation. But even as her reputation grew in those dimly lit rooms where smoke and alcohol created the atmosphere classical concert halls lacked, the fundamental tragedy of her situation was becoming clear. She was becoming famous for a musical identity that felt like exile from her true calling, celebrated for talents that represented compromise rather than fulfillment. The little girl who had refused to play for segregated audiences was now performing in venues where the segregation was economic rather than legal but just as real. Was this detour from her classical dreams actually leading towards something greater than Eunice Waymon could have imagined? Could Nina Simone become a revolutionary force that the concert pianist never could have been? The questions followed her from Atlantic City clubs to New York recording studios, where she was about to discover that her voice could become far more dangerous than even she dared dream. The late 1950s brought Nina Simone to the attention of a music industry that had no category for what she represented. Her debut album, Little Girl Blue, showcased a voice that could deliver I Loves You, Porgy with operatic grandeur, while making original compositions feel like dispatches from the depths of urban loneliness. Critics struggled to classify her, eventually settling on jazz singer, a label that captured almost nothing about the revolution she was creating. At the Village Vanguard, the Blue Note, and other temples of sophisticated nightlife, Nina established an entirely new relationship between performer and audience. She didn't simply interpret songs, she inhabited them so completely that listeners felt they were witnessing psychological excavation rather than entertainment. Her classical training allowed her to structure performances with symphonic complexity, building tension through dynamics and calculated silence before releasing emotions with the force of natural disasters. The marriage to Andrew Stroud in 1961 brought both stability and a new form of imprisonment. Stroud was devoted manager and controlling husband, someone who recognized her genius while trying to contain it within commercially viable boundaries. Their relationship became a microcosm of her larger struggle, the constant tension between artistic integrity and financial survival, between the revolutionary potential brewing inside her and the practical demands of building a career in racist America. Their daughter Lisa's birth in 1962 added another layer of beautiful complexity to Nina's already fragmented existence. Motherhood brought profound joy, shadowed by equally profound guilt as she struggled to balance the demands of touring with her desperate desire to be present for her child. The domestic violence that increasingly characterized her marriage remained hidden from public view. But those close to her could see the toll it was taking on a woman whose entire identity was built around maintaining absolute control over her voice and her art. The mainstream breakthrough came with her haunting interpretation of "I Put a Spell on You," where she transformed Screamin' Jay Hawkins' wild novelty song into something primal and hypnotic. Nina's classical precision created space for emotional depths that most popular music couldn't access, her technique serving emotions that seemed to rise from places deeper than individual experience. But success brought new pressures that felt like another form of artistic imprisonment. Record executives wanted more of the same, sophisticated interpretations that could satisfy both jazz critics and pop audiences without making anyone uncomfortable enough to change radio stations. Nina complied while growing increasingly restless with the entertainer role that success demanded. She was becoming famous for being untouchable, mysterious, elegant. Qualities that were beginning to feel like performance rather than authentic expression of her growing political consciousness. Behind all that musical mastery was there a rage building that would soon demand expression in ways that comfortable audiences could never ignore or forgive. The signs were visible to those who knew how to read them. The increasing intensity of her live performances, the way she seemed to be searching for something beyond mere musical satisfaction, the growing references to freedom and resistance in her song choices and between-song commentary. By 1963, Nina Simone was becoming aware that her extraordinary gifts carried obligations beyond artistic achievement. The little girl who had stopped playing until her parents could sit in the front row was growing into a woman who understood that silence in the face of injustice was betrayal of everything her talent represented. The transformation from entertainer to activist was about to begin, and it would cost her almost everything except her soul. The moment that changed everything came not in a recording studio or concert hall, but in her Mount Vernon living room, watching television coverage of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, murdered while preparing for Sunday service. Their names burning themselves into Nina's consciousness with the permanence of childhood scars. Mississippi Goddam poured out of her that same afternoon, a song of pure fury disguised as a Broadway show tune. The musical irony was deliberate and devastating, using the cheerful rhythms of white entertainment to deliver a message that challenged every assumption about what black performers were supposed to say to paying audiences. The song was a hand grenade wrapped in silk, beautiful enough to get radio play before anyone understood what was exploding in their speakers. The 1964 performance of Mississippi Goddam at Carnegie Hall, the venue where she had once dreamed of playing Chopin nocturnes, completed her transformation from sophisticated entertainer to musical revolutionary. Standing at the piano bench where she had planned to make her classical debut, she instead delivered a manifesto that made it impossible for anyone in the audience to remain comfortable with American reality. Here was the cosmic irony of her entire existence. She had finally made it to Carnegie Hall, the temple of her childhood dreams, but not as the classical pianist Eunice Waymon had wanted to become. Instead, Nina Simone conquered it as something far more dangerous, a truth-teller who used her conservatory training to make revolution sound like high art. The little girl's dream had been fulfilled and destroyed simultaneously, replaced by something more urgent than personal achievement. The song's reception revealed the fault lines running through both her audience and American society itself. Progressive fans celebrated her courage in speaking truth to power, while others felt betrayed by the political turn her music was taking. Radio programmers who had once competed to play her romantic ballads now treated her new material as dangerous propaganda that could contaminate their carefully curated playlists. But Nina had discovered something intoxicating about using her platform for more than entertainment. Unlike Billie Holiday, whose Strange Fruit sang about death with devastating beauty, Nina was singing about resistance with equally devastating fury. Where Billie had made audiences weep for the victims of American racism, Nina was demanding they get angry enough to become participants in changing it. The friendship with James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry provided intellectual framework for her growing radicalism. These relationships showed her that art and activism weren't separate pursuits, but different expressions of the same commitment to truth-telling in a society built on beautiful lies. Baldwin especially understood the particular burden of being a black artist whose gifts carried obligations to speak for those who had no platform from which to speak. Did this political awakening represent the fulfillment of her true artistic destiny, or the beginning of a tragic conflict between her musical genius and her revolutionary convictions? The question would haunt the rest of her career as she discovered that America was far more comfortable with her voice when it wasn't demanding that listeners examine their own complicity in systems of oppression. The songs that followed traced the arc of her complete transformation from entertainer to prophet. Cinnamon, with its driving gospel rhythm and apocalyptic imagery, became a musical representation of moral urgency that couldn't be ignored or postponed. To Be Young, Gifted and Black, written in honor of her deceased friend Lorraine Hansberry, offered hope while acknowledging the special burdens that came with extraordinary talent in a country that preferred its black citizens ordinary. But each political song cost her mainstream acceptance, record sales, radio airplay, and bookings at prestigious venues that had once competed for her presence. The entertainment industry had loved Nina Simone, the sophisticated jazz diva. It had no framework for dealing with Nina Simone, the musical revolutionary, who refused to sing pretty songs while her people were dying in southern streets and northern ghettos. The backlash was swift, systematic, and financially devastating. Venues found reasons to cancel bookings. Record companies pressured her to return to safe material. Radio stations played her older songs while blacklisting anything that sounded too much like organized resistance. The price of authenticity was becoming clear. Artistic integrity would mean commercial exile from the very industry that had created her fame. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 shattered whatever faith Nina still maintained in moderate approaches to racial justice. If peaceful protest couldn't protect even the movement's most beloved leader, What hope existed for change through conventional political channels? Her response was to embrace even more radical positions, expressing sympathy for Black Power movements that many of her former supporters found terrifying. The woman who had once been celebrated as a sophisticated interpreter of American songbook standards was now being described as dangerous, unpatriotic, a threat to social order. The transformation was complete. She had become exactly what she had set out to be, and it was systematically destroying everything she had built during her ascent to fame. The financial and emotional pressures were enormous, but the artistic pressure was perhaps worse. Nina found herself caught between commercial demands that required her to betray her convictions and political expectations that seemed to reduce her complex artistry to simple protest messaging. The music industry wanted her to return to being Nina Simone the entertainer. The civil rights movement needed her to remain Nina Simone, the voice of resistance. Neither role felt complete enough to contain her full humanity. The marriage to Andrew Stroud deteriorated as these pressures mounted. His dual role as husband and manager created impossible conflicts. He needed to protect her career while she was determined to use that career as a weapon against the systems that had created their middle-class comfort. The domestic violence escalated as both struggled with forces beyond their control, two people drowning in different oceans while tied to the same sinking ship. Can anyone survive becoming the person they were truly meant to be when that person is unacceptable to the world around them? Nina's story was becoming a test case for whether artistic integrity and political courage could coexist with professional survival in a country that demanded its entertainers remain entertaining rather than enlightening. By 1970, the answer seemed devastatingly clear. But Nina Simone had never been interested in easy answers or comfortable compromises. She had chosen truth over success, authenticity over acceptance, moral clarity over financial security. The consequences were reshaping not just her career but her fundamental relationship with the country that had both nurtured and rejected her extraordinary gifts. The decision to leave America wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable conclusion of a decade spent learning that her homeland preferred its Black artists grateful rather than angry, nostalgic rather than revolutionary, dead rather than dangerous. By 1970, Nina Simone had become a prophet without honor in her own country, performing for smaller audiences who appreciated her politics but sometimes seemed to forget her artistry. The move to Barbados, then to Liberia, represented her attempt to find a place where she could be both artist and activist without apology. In Africa, she hoped to discover the roots of the musical traditions she had spent her career transforming, to understand the deeper sources of rhythms and emotions that had always felt more natural to her than European classical forms. But exile brought its own form of suffering that she hadn't anticipated. Away from the American civil rights struggle that had given her work such urgent meaning, Nina found herself searching for new sources of inspiration and purpose. The musical fusion she created during this period was innovative but somehow less vital than her protest songs. Brilliant exercises in cross-cultural collaboration that lacked the life-or-death intensity of her American revolutionary work. The mental health struggles that had been building for years became harder to hide during her African exile. The manic episodes that had once fueled creative breakthroughs now seemed disconnected from artistic purpose, lasting longer and cutting deeper into her sense of self. The depressions that followed her periods of intense activity left her increasingly isolated from the communities that had once sustained her revolutionary fire. The few recordings from this period reveal an artist still in command of extraordinary technical abilities, but searching for emotional and political contexts that could give those abilities the meaning they had possessed during her American years. Songs like Baltimore showed she could still channel social consciousness into musical brilliance, but the geographical and cultural distances were making it harder to maintain the immediate connection to struggle that had made her protest music so powerful. Friends and family members who visited during these years describe a woman caught between irreconcilable identities, too American for comfortable life in Africa, too radical for easy return to American stages, too political for pure artistic expression, too artistic for simple political messaging. The synthesis that had made her revolutionary was becoming harder to maintain as the social conditions that had created it disappeared. The question that haunted her during these decades of exile was whether artistic genius could survive without the specific cultural conflicts that had originally shaped it. Could Nina Simone exist meaningfully without the American contradictions that had created her voice? Was the price of political integrity the gradual erosion of everything that had made her unique in the first place? Can anyone ever truly escape from the country that created their artistic voice, even when that country has made clear it no longer wants to hear what that voice has learned to say? The years stretched into decades, and the world began to forget what Nina Simone had meant beyond the handful of songs that survived in popular memory. Feeling Good became a standard covered by countless artists who had no understanding of the political context that had shaped its original interpreter. Her voice was being preserved in amber while her revolutionary message was being carefully edited out of cultural memory. The gradual return to America in the 1990s should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like visiting the scene of an ancient crime. The country had changed enough to celebrate her as a historic figure while remaining fundamentally uncomfortable with the contemporary relevance of her message. She was honored as a pioneer while being treated as a relic, praised for past courage while being reminded that such courage was no longer necessary or appropriate. The final performances of her career were marked by an almost mystical intensity that transcended technical considerations. Age and illness had taken their toll on her voice, but somehow this made her singing more rather than less powerful. Stripped of the flawless technique that had once defined her artistry, she was left with only the essential core, pure emotion, unfiltered truth, the distilled essence of everything she had learned about using music to speak the unspeakable. Young audiences discovering her for the first time were stunned by the power of her presence, but they were experiencing her as historical artifact rather than living force. The civil rights struggle that had given her work such urgency was being remembered as completed history rather than ongoing reality, and her songs were being heard as museum pieces rather than calls to contemporary action. The loneliness of those final years was extraordinary and complete. She had outlived most of the movements and relationships that had given her life meaning beyond music. The daughter from whom she had become estranged represented both her greatest love and her deepest regret, living proof that the choices required by artistic integrity could destroy the personal connections that made existence bearable. But perhaps the most bitter irony of her final years was watching her mental health struggles become a way for comfortable people to dismiss her political positions. The bipolar disorder that was finally properly diagnosed and treated became a convenient explanation for those who preferred to see her anger as mental illness rather than moral clarity, her rage as medical symptom rather than appropriate response to systemic injustice. Were these final years evidence of the ultimate failure of her radical choices? Or proof that some forms of artistic and political courage are simply too expensive for any single human being to sustain across a lifetime? The peaceful death in that French villa seemed almost anticlimactic for someone who had lived with such volcanic intensity. But perhaps it was fitting that she died far from the country that had both celebrated and exiled her, in a place where her music could be appreciated without the political complications that had made her such a controversial figure in the land that had shaped her voice. The death of Nina Simone marked the end of something unprecedented in American culture. An artist who had refused to separate aesthetic excellence from political commitment, who had used classical training and popular platforms to create a form of musical activism that remained unmatched decades after her peak influence. But her death also revealed how much more comfortable the world was with her legacy than it had ever been with her living presence. The immediate tributes focused on her musical innovations and her role in the civil rights movement while carefully avoiding the deeper implications of what she had attempted and achieved. She was celebrated as a pioneer while the contemporary relevance of her message was politely ignored, honored for her courage while that courage was being emptied of any meaning that might make current audiences uncomfortable. Songs like Mississippi Goddam were praised as historical documents while their ongoing relevance to American racial dynamics was carefully avoided. The sanitized remembrances that dominated media coverage managed to celebrate her while missing entirely the essential point. Nina Simone had tried to prove that art could be a weapon without losing its beauty, that political commitment could enhance rather than diminish artistic excellence. The conspiracy theories that emerged focused on whether powerful forces had deliberately worked to marginalize her during her peak years, whether her exile had been orchestrated by those who found her political message too dangerous for mainstream consumption. But perhaps the real conspiracy was simpler and more systemic, a culture that claimed to value both artistic excellence and social justice while making it practically impossible for anyone to pursue both simultaneously, without paying an impossible price. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2018 represented the final transformation of Nina Simone from dangerous radical to safe historical figure. She had achieved the dubious honor of being remembered for her courage, while that courage was being systematically drained of any contemporary relevance. The woman who had declared that an artist's duty is to reflect the times was being celebrated by a culture that preferred its artists to reflect nothing more challenging than personal emotion and individual struggle. What remains most powerful about Nina Simone's legacy isn't the individual songs or performances that survived her death, but the example she set of an artist who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on her gifts. She proved that extraordinary talent carried extraordinary obligations, that comfort and artistic integrity were often incompatible, that the choice between personal happiness and moral duty was real and unavoidable for anyone blessed with the power to make people listen. The final tragedy isn't that she died in exile, but that the synthesis she achieved, classical precision serving popular accessibility serving political activism, remains as rare and controversial today as it was during her lifetime. Half a century after Mississippi Goddam, the entertainment industry remains largely segregated between art and politics, between beauty and truth, between what audiences want to hear and what they desperately need to understand. Her voice survives in recordings that continue to surprise listeners with their power to move and disturb simultaneously. But the question she posed through her entire career remains as urgent and unanswered as ever. Can American culture sustain artists who insist on using their gifts to challenge systems of power rather than simply reflecting and reinforcing them? What hidden truths about the relationship between talent and obligation, between artistic success and moral courage, might Nina Simone's extraordinary life reveal to artists still struggling with the choice between comfort and conscience, between entertainment and enlightenment, between preserving their gifts and wielding them as weapons for justice in a world that prefers its truth served with enough sugar to make the medicine go down easy?